Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I do apologize if this video sounds a little bit hoarse. I have definitely been having some problems with my voice as of late and losing it on more than one occasion. But the show must go on, and today I would like to talk about the concept of multiplayer-only gaming. This particular topic has been a subject of discussion quite frequently during 2015, and the reason for that is because we have seen quite a number of full-priced or near-to-full-price multiplayer-only titles that completely forego any sort of meaningful single-player mode. This discussion, I think, has been amplified by certain releases, not least of which, in fact, probably the poster child for which, is Star Wars Battlefront, a game that lacks in so many areas, which has resulted in quite a few people pointing the finger at the lack of single player. The fires of the argument have been stoked by needlessly sensationalist pieces such as why single player is superior to multiplayer by This Gen Gaming, Rainbow Six Siege and the Sad Death of Single Player Games by Ars Technica, and so on and so forth, because what's better for making ad revenue than stoking controversy? I am going to take a large bucket of cold water and pour it all over your controversy and hopefully also your enthusiasm so that you can be miserable, jaded, and apathetic like me as we talk a little bit about multiplayer-only gaming. So, first things first, when did the advent of AAA multiplayer-only gaming really begin? Well, there are actually quite a few examples of AAA or close to AAA titles that have been multiplayer-only experiences, and they do go back quite some time. I'm speaking, of course, of online multiplayer as opposed to local, since examples of that go back to, oh yeah, Pong. Yeah, that's a bit old. What we would consider the modern definition of online multiplayer gaming is certainly a relatively recent development, all things considered, but it actually does go back far, far longer than most people seem to realize. There were various solutions back in the day that would allow for online multiplayer, one of the first of which was so-called BBS, or the Bulletin Board System. In fact, it goes back even further than that. There was a system called Plato, which allowed for some limited multiplayer functionality in the late 70s, if you can actually believe that. It does go back way, way longer than most people realize. Indeed, I recall being able to play multi-user dungeons or MUDs through the Telnet client, and of course those had been around since the 80s. I think there's a fairly clear divide to be drawn, however, between the advent of multiplayer gaming and the first multiplayer-capable games over the internet versus the widespread adoption and accessibility of online multiplayer games over the internet. Early services such as The Zone allowed for limited online matchmaking with certain titles, and of course that operated throughout the 90s. Direct connection multiplayer, which allowed for one computer to physically dial the modem of another over a phone line and connect for a 1v1 match, was also available for titles such as the original Warcraft in 1994. But the question is, when did we see development of premium titles that were online only? Well, I think a lot of people would of course be familiar with some of the earlier MMOs. Those subscription model games were some of the first big examples of titles that did not have a dedicated single-player mode. Indeed, these were titles that were actually very expensive to play. Not only did the box usually cost as much as a regular PC game, but you were forced to spend a monthly subscription, and back in the days of earlier dial-up, you were sometimes paying by the minute in order to access the service through your ISP. There's perhaps a not-so-strange acceptance of the business models of MMOs, at least there certainly were back then, simply because these games were so complicated and allowed you to play with so many more people than any other genre. It seemed like the premium was perhaps worth it. You know, it was a high-end experience, a premium and unique experience that you simply could not get anywhere else. And of course, as a result, some people were willing to pay through the nose for it. These aren't really the titles that I would say most gamers have a problem with, however. The titles that have caused the most consternation are multiplayer-only titles which are not, in fact, persistent online universes. They are not subscription-based model games. They are titles in genres that very well in the past may have had a single-player mode, and yet the latest iterations in said genres and franchises forego that mode entirely in favor of multiplayer only. Now, one needs to be very careful with defining the notion of multiplayer only, because almost all of these titles feature some form of single-player content. However, it is usually an afterthought and extremely underdeveloped. What I think we mean by multiplayer-only games are games that lack a single-player, narratively driven campaign mode. Games with bots don't really count. Quake 3 is not a single-player game by nature just because you have access to bots. It was a game first and foremost designed for the multiplayer experience. Was there outcry back at that time because Quake 3 Arena released without any kind of significant single-player content? Well, yes, amongst some people, certainly. Quake before that was known for its campaign mode, although, of course, Quake 1 and 2 both had very robust multiplayer modes as well as a thriving modding scene. However, Quake 3 Arena tossed the campaign out of the window entirely in favor of bot matches and a focus on multiplayer gaming. Regardless of these complaints, Quake 3 Arena is considered a classic, and rightfully so. So where did this recent backlash against multiplayer-only gaming come from? Where did it originate? Was there a specific catalyst? Was there a specific game that perhaps started this particular snowball rolling down the hill? Well, I think it's probably Titanfall. That seems like the most identifiable high-profile title that actually started to cause this general feeling amongst certain gamers that multiplayer-only games were taking over. This led to a number of concerns as well as a number of fears, the most obvious of which being that single-player games were being phased out in favor of multiplayer-only titles. It's very difficult to see the logic behind that particular complaint. It's certainly a slippery slope argument at best, and we have not seen a significant drop in the development of single-player titles. Indeed, in 2015, we saw more single-player games than ever, but that is down to the fact that we generally see more games than ever now in the modern marketplace, especially when you take into account platforms such as Android and iOS. I remember a similar concern years ago that everything would eventually become an MMO. That, of course, never happened, and indeed, one could say that MMOs are very much on the decline, with very few successful subscription-based models, and even genre leaders such as World of Warcraft suffering from reduced population. It would, however, be unfair to characterize the complaints and the general feeling of discontent as the result of an irrational endgame apocalypse scenario. In reality, if you look at the current complaints surrounding titles such as Rainbow Six Siege, Star Wars Battlefront, Overwatch, and of course Titanfall, and even going further back to titles such as Brink and Quake Wars Enemy Territory, you'll find that many of the concerns are actually rooted in the notion of the value proposition. This is not as simple as just saying this game is too expensive. You're going to see that complaint a lot, but it's important to realize where and in what that complaint is actually rooted. The value proposition of a game is highly subjective, and the willingness of an individual gamer to pay X price for Y experience varies on a gamer-by-gamer basis. We see it all the time, whether it be with shorter game experiences such as Brothers or Gone Home or indeed Journey, whether it be with remasters of older titles. I think every single consumer has in their mind, whether they realize it or not, a bit of a checklist that determines whether or not they feel a product is actually worthy of their time, and that's going to change on a gamer-by-gamer basis based on their preferences and priorities. When it comes to multiplayer-only experiences, however, I think I've identified a few characteristics and concerns that seem to contribute to this overall feeling of multiplayer-only games shouldn't be full price. The first of these seems to be a preconception as to what a AAA game actually needs to be. The industry over a number of years has built up an expectation of the kind of features that should be included in a $60 AAA release. Foremost amongst these features seems to be a meaningful single-player mode of some description. It seems like games can miss out on almost anything else, whether it be local co-op, online co-op, whether it be multiplayer at all. And gamers as a whole will still accept the notion that the product is worthy of $60. This is not a universal truth by any means. There are plenty of single-player only games that have been criticized for having relatively short single-player campaigns and a lack of replayability or alternative modes. However, more often than not, as long as a single-player title has enough content, those complaints will not materialize in any significant number. Nobody argues with the value proposition of a game like Skyrim, Fallout 4, or Witcher 3, and indeed that is the case in many games that feature an open world, despite the fact that quite a few of the activities in many of those games are actually subpar. They're considered to be filler over killer and emphasizing quantity over quality. In my video in regards to Mad Max's negative reviews earlier in the year, I pointed out that many gamers are in fact willing to accept the nature of such activities as long as they get a good number of hours out of their $60 purchase. The average consumer does not have the luxury to seek out the highest quality per hour entertainment. They're often looking for quantity because, let's be frank, video games can be quite expensive. Therein, however, lies one of the most interesting contradictions with perhaps the pushback against multiplayer-only titles when making the value proposition argument based on hours played per dollar. Multiplayer-only titles, in fact, generally have extremely favorable hours-to-dollar ratios. They are played for hundreds upon hundreds of hours, and as a result, one would think that many people view this as great value for money. There is a reason why Call of Duty is bought every single year at $60, and there is a reason why the map pack DLC for said game is able to rake in a further $50. It's because the people that buy Call of Duty generally play it the entire year until another one comes out. Despite vocal pushback from many core gamers, the Call of Duty franchise is in fact a great value proposition for millions. The same value questions don't really come up, despite the fact that most recent Call of Duty games have a fairly token campaign that doesn't really last all that long. The interesting experiment, assuming that it would ever happen, is whether or not a Call of Duty game would come out without a single-player campaign at all, and how that would affect sales and perception. Would we have the massive backlash, despite the fact that it is well known that Call of Duty is played primarily for the multiplayer? We unfortunately don't have data for that. We can try and make a comparison, however, to the game developed by some of the head honchos behind the Call of Duty franchise, Titanfall, a multiplayer-only game. The development philosophy and business model behind this title seems to be based on their experience with Call of Duty. Knowing, perhaps more than anybody, that Call of Duty was played primarily for the multiplayer, they believed that releasing original IP with multiplayer-only functionality and monetizing it post-launch via a Season Pass map pack system would work just as well as it did with Call of Duty. And yet it didn't. In fact, on PC, Titanfall has a very small population still playing. If you're the sort of person that really only pays attention to the PC side of things, then the chances are you believe Titanfall is very much a dead game. This, of course, isn't necessarily true. On Xbox One and Xbox 360, Titanfall is still fairly populous and is played by a great number of people. So why the disconnection? Why is there a difference between platforms, especially considering that multiplayer FPS are really at home on PC? Well, to figure that one out, you've got to go back to the idea of value proposition and all of the factors which will influence said value proposition in the minds of the consumer. The PC is the most competitive platform for multiplayer first-person shooters that exists. It has the most active multiplayer first-person shooter games available on the market. Games on the PC platform have a tendency to have an extremely long lifespan if properly supported. There is a reason why Call of Duty 4 Pro Mod is still played 8 years after the release of the title on PC. Titanfall is also competing with first-person shooters that have huge player bases and business models which are severely reducing or completely removing the financial barrier to entry. Team Fortress 2 remains extremely popular. Counter-Strike Go is the most popular game on Steam, and of course is sold at the price of $15, not $60. You don't find people complaining about the lack of single player in Counter-Strike Go. Titanfall is exclusive to a less popular distribution platform, Origin, Titanfall is not available on Steam. Titanfall made perhaps the fatal mistake of attempting to sell map pack DLC in an environment where the player base was keenly aware that the concurrent player count was dropping by the day. People don't want to spend money on a title that they perceive to be dying. That strikes at the heart of one of the key problems that AAA multiplayer-only releases have to face. They face the notion that should a game drop to a certain level, a certain low level of players, the game will become essentially unplayable for those that purchased it. In addition, many modern online multiplayer games lack LAN functionality and lack the ability to set up community servers, meaning that support for the game is not guaranteed past a certain point. If support for the game is dropped, it is entirely possible that the game will become literally unplayable. If server support on the developer's end for these games is shut down, then how exactly do you expect to access the multiplayer? Some games have clever workarounds, and of course the addition of LAN mode to a game like that will allow it to persist through virtual LAN emulations such as Tungle and Hamachi. Many older titles continue to live on through clients such as Game Ranger. However, more and more multiplayer games are being so intrinsically tied into the developer's master server that the death of said title can very much be at the whim of that developer. This isn't paranoia. This is not a what-if scenario. This has happened. There is a history of it. Indeed, EA are one of the most notorious publishers and developers when it comes to shutting down the multiplayer functionality of games, and several of their titles have of course been multiplayer only. I recall with great fondness and significantly more bitterness the experience of Battleforge, a collectible strategy game published by Electronic Arts in 2009. It was the last major game released by EA Phenomic, which after a couple of Facebook and iOS games was shut down in 2013 by EA, such is unfortunately the fate of many such studios. Battleforge was a game that not only cost money to purchase in the box, but had further microtransactions within the game when it came to acquiring new units and cards. All of the acquisitions that every player made in this game, whether through monetary investment or progress, are of course now irrelevant. The game was shut down in 2013. All of your progress lost, all of your investment, if you can call it that, wiped off the face of the planet. If you need an example of the nightmare scenario, Battleforge is it. And indeed, when this happened to Battleforge, there was significant backlash that came from that decision. While Titanfall may have very much got the recent fires burning, I'll safely say that Battleforge was one of the earlier sparks and catalysts of this discussion. Every multiplayer-only game on any platform is at risk of entering what's called the death spiral. It's a multifaceted problem that tends to compound on top itself, however it always results from a dropping player base. The lower player base means that the pool of talent is more concentrated. It means that matchmaking in order to get you against an opponent of your skill level is more difficult because the player pool is smaller. It means that the barrier to entry is generally higher. You will be matched against people who are a lot better than you. You will have to learn under harsher conditions, and as a result you are more likely to quit the game. More competitive players are likely to be equally frustrated by this, unable to find players of their caliber to play at the high level that they desire. Games with a large number of game modes generally suffer from this quicker, simply because the player pool is diluted between multiple modes, and the more game modes there are, the less players there are to create lobbies and servers and full games for said modes. As a result, the later you go into a title's life, the more you see the less popular modes simply dying off and becoming unplayable without a fixed group organized beforehand. This is, I believe, the fate that we will see with Star Wars Battlefront. I mean, it's a fate that began at the launch of Star Wars Battlefront, with less popular modes taking longer to find games for and having a much larger spread of player levels when it came to experience progression and unlocks. The strange irony of that, I suppose, is that having a large number of game modes is considered a positive within the value proposition for most games. And indeed, a lack of game modes has been cited on numerous occasions when criticizing very recent multiplayer releases. Rainbow Six Siege is a prime example of this. The match-made game mode in Rainbow Six Siege is a 5 versus 5 attack-defense scenario in which teams swap roles on a round-by-round basis, and the first team to win by 2 in a potential 5-match series crowned the winner. This is the mode that you will play on various maps if you queue into matchmaking. There are a couple of other modes available, but they are either single-player or cooperative terrorist hunts against the AI. The primary multiplayer mode in the matchmaking is always the same. And yes, that has been brought up as a criticism of the title. There's a certain cruel irony there as well. One of the other criticisms that is often brought up when it comes to multiplayer games is the fear that the player base will get too small, that it will enter that death spiral. Rainbow Six Siege sort of proofs itself against that by saying this is the mode that you will all queue into. As a result, the population is less likely to enter said death spiral, and it's less likely that a player will have trouble finding a game. Although, of course, later on in the game's lifespan, we will see again the skill gap and the frustrations that come from that. It's become more obvious over the past few years that many vocal core gamers have become more aware and more concerned about a game's lifespan. This, I imagine, is a concern coming from several places. Firstly, it is more prevalent on the PC platform due to our inability to trade games in. Secondly, gamers have become very aware of the historical precedent to shut down game servers at a certain point in the game's lifespan to essentially kill the game off, and that is outside of their control. They've also become more aware of the associated costs with continually supporting a game, and they know that in many cases, a major publisher will stop supporting a game and then potentially shut the servers down when the revenue stream for that title has dried up. Some gamers are concerned now not with the fun that they will have when they buy the game, but the fun that they may have 3 years down the line after having bought the game. And is that wrong? Absolutely not. Is it unreasonable? No. Is it entitled? Certainly not. We don't use that word. It's a dirty word. That's not to say that some people's expectations are realistic. That's not to say that some people's expectations are perhaps a little bit unreasonable. Okay, in some cases very unreasonable. But there is absolutely nothing wrong, indeed I would applaud being a conscientious and sensible, smart consumer. I think perhaps the best example in recent memory that illustrates the concern that core gamers have for the lifespan and development cycle of a game post-release has got to come with Overwatch. In a recent interview with Eurogamer, Jeff Kaplan made a statement that, if taken at face value, is perhaps very surprising to some people, but indicates the continued shift in priorities amongst some PC core gamers. When asked a question about the announcement of the full business model for the title, he stated, and quote, "We were really not expecting to be asked what was going to happen after the game was launched. It takes so much work to ship a game. So there we are at BlizzCon and people are just hammering us, and you kind of realize that, wow, there's a lot of distrust out in the community, because I think a lot of players have felt like they've been burned in the past." He went on to say that in hindsight, he understood where the player stress came from, and it actually seems so obvious. He totally gets, he claims, that players had apprehension, and it was very nice to put them at ease. This is not a new fear for the industry. It's not even a new fear within Blizzard titles specifically. Hardcore StarCraft 2 fans have been concerned for years about the development of the game and what would happen after Legacy of the Void, the final chapter of the trilogy, had been released. They were concerned that development support for the title would cease, and as a result, the competitive scene for the game that they love so much would end up dying out. Blizzard went out of their way, I believe, to try and address these concerns, but it got to the extreme point of some people demanding a way to give Blizzard money. More money, to make sure that StarCraft continued to be viable. They were that worried about the future longevity of a game that has already been out for 5 years. They wanted microtransactions. People were asking for microtransactions. I mean, that's insane when you think about it. If you look at the average gaming forum on the internet, you'll find that it's full of complaints about games that include microtransactions, and yet here we are, a group of people asking, let us give you more money, because we're so worried that if your revenue stream for this game dies off, you will kill off the title and move on. Even a company like Blizzard that has historically supported their games far beyond the usual time frame. This is a company that was patching Diablo 2 and StarCraft Brood War 10 years after release. Even they aren't immune to the concerns of the value proposition. The phrase that you've probably read a great deal of over the past couple of years is this: $60 for a multiplayer-only game is too expensive. Despite the game receiving a great deal of buzz as well as very positive critical reviews, Rainbow Six Siege, when mentioned on any forum, is guaranteed to attract those comments. I'm not paying $60 for it. I'll maybe buy it when it goes down in price. A multiplayer-only game is not worth $60. It's a hardline attitude. It's rooted in valid concerns, but I do certainly have the feeling that there are a number of people that are just completely stuck to the notion that a $60 game must include X, Y, and Z. Some of that probably comes down to a growing understanding, or in many cases misunderstanding, of how much it costs to develop a video game. There is an argument to be made that the removal of the single-player element from certain games is done as a cost-cutting measure, and as a result, since you spent less developing the game, you should charge less for it. Some people want to know how the sausage is made. Some people assume that they know how the sausage is made, but perhaps they don't. And there are others that really only care about how the sausage tastes or how much it fills them up. In reality, it's actually quite difficult to come up with a reasonable argument against $60 multiplayer-only titles. The price concerns are in many ways arbitrary. What is the acceptable amount of money that should be paid for such a game? Is it 40? Is it 20? Is it 15? A lot of it's dictated by the standards of the platform that you're on. If we go back to the Titanfall example, think about exactly when it was released, and think about the platforms it was released on. On Xbox One, Titanfall was one of the only multiplayer shooters available. Even now, just over 2 years after release, there are 25 first-person shooters on the Xbox One. Of these, only 11 of them are competitive online multiplayer games. Even now, Titanfall's competition on that platform is slim. And back then, it was competing with Battlefield 4, Call of Duty Ghosts, and Blacklight Retribution. That was it. 2 AAA games and a free-to-play title. It's much, much easier to justify $60 when the scarcity of the game type that you enjoy is so crazy on the platform that you own. And on PC, that scarcity does not exist. Games on PC are cheaper, they're more varied, they're more customizable experiences. That all sounds great, but think of the risks, think of the problems that come with entering a market such as this. PC has a veritable boneyard of multiplayer games that are completely dead. Up to this point, I've really only been talking about AAA titles, but indie games are suffering so much more, perhaps, than AAA when it comes to trying to release multiplayer only. The game can be dead on arrival, the game can be stillborn. If there's not a reasonable player count on day one available for your game, then you got people that will hold off on buying it, and there's your catch-22. If players aren't buying, the player base remains small, but they're not buying because the player base is small, and perhaps expecting the customer to solve that problem themselves is unreasonable. And who can solve that problem? Nobody. It's sometimes not a problem that can ever be solved. Even going absolutely free does not necessarily result in a healthy player base for your game. An example that immediately springs to mind is Warsaw, a very competent competitive arena shooter that's absolutely free. There are currently 39 players online on the weekend in US prime time. There's a reason why so many multiplayer-only games decide to go down the free-to-play route. Removing the barrier to entry entirely is a good way of encouraging a constant flow of new players. Implementing persistent account-based progression means that players are more likely to be retained simply as a result of the sunk cost fallacy. Players are generally not so willing to leave a game if they've invested a bunch of time into it and have progress and unlocks on their account to show for it. This is infinitely more true when you add microtransactions. At that point, a player has invested actual money into his account. And of course, the attitude amongst many is, well, if I left now, I wasted all that money. That's not really true, of course. That's why sunk cost is a fallacy, and a dangerous one sometimes. But you can understand people's point of view. I was so unwilling to leave World of Warcraft due to the amount of money that I had spent on it and the amount of progress that my character had gone through. I was unwilling to leave League of Legends for the same reason. Despite this, I think the attitude of some players is that free-to-play games are a safer bet. If we go back to that game lifespan concern, then a game that is constantly updated with monetizable content is more likely to enjoy continued support over a number of years. There are, of course, downsides to this, however. As a player base gets smaller, it's possible that the developers may become further and further exploitative in order to keep the game afloat. Hardcore players, or whales, will be monetized to sometimes ludicrous degrees, and due to their commitment and passion for the game, they may end up spending far, far more than you would ever imagine. If you knew how much I'd spent in Star Trek Online on virtual ships, you would probably vomit. But that game has a hardcore following, and Star Trek fans are anything if not passionate about their particular product. It's a little strange that we've got to this point, although I suppose it's fairly logical. Everybody has an internet connection these days. Everybody has broadband. Online multiplayer is across all fronts easier than ever before to use, and that's on every single format. We live in the generation that is always online, always connected. There was a time that we weren't really discussing tacked-on single-player content, we were discussing tacked-on multiplayer content. In 2007, I bought a game called The Darkness for my Xbox 360. I only later discovered that it had a multiplayer mode. Nobody was playing it. It was underdeveloped, ill-conceived, and dead on arrival. It served no purpose. It wasted development time, it wasted development budget. That time and budget could have been spent expanding the single-player component of the game. Although, you've got to bear in mind that game development is not zero-sum. Games don't have strict budgets. Cutting a component out of a game doesn't necessarily mean that that budget will be available for something else. But sometimes it can be fairly difficult to convince gamers of that. When spokespeople for AAA developers or publishers come out and say, we cut X feature because we wanted to spend more time and more money developing Y feature, we don't know if they're telling the truth. And when games like Battlefront come out, gamers are found scratching their heads saying, well, where did the money that would have been spent on the single player go then? We don't know that. We don't know the budget of the game. We have no idea. But whenever something like that happens, it's going to sour gamers' perceptions of the argument that somehow the single-player content was cut for their benefit. What's the crude phrase? Don't piss on my head and call it rain. Yeah, I think that is fairly applicable in many cases where a developer has come out and said, we did this for your own good. It's easy to lament a change when it comes to a beloved franchise. It's easy if you happen to be a fan of the older Rainbow Six games to turn around and claim that Rainbow Six Siege is worthless because it doesn't have a proper campaign, it doesn't have a proper terrorist hunt mode. It's understandable, but simultaneously it's unfortunate. As someone that was a fan of the older Rainbow Six games and disliked Vegas, my first impressions of Rainbow Six Siege are that it is the game that I've enjoyed most in the franchise since Rainbow Six Raven Shield. The fact that it is not a traditional Rainbow Six game, while a black mark in the eyes of fans, should not, I think, distract people from looking into all of the things that game does very right. I think I have to conclude that the problem with $60 multiplayer games is that of perception. Perception heavily influenced by numerous past failures, and a not unreasonable fear that the game's value proposition will not be fulfilled. In reality, a competitive multiplayer game can have indeterminate value. Some of the more narrow-minded are dismissive of multiplayer games, claiming that they don't have any story. It's impossible to care about the lore. Where is the narrative? And my response to that is, of course, the players are creating it every time they enter a match. And every story is just that little bit different. I think deep down, most people know that. I think deep down, they understand just how much you can get out of a multiplayer game. They understand that having essentially infinite content can be very beneficial. But you look at the history of full-price AAA multiplayer-only releases over the past few years. You look at your Battlefronts, you look at your Evolves, you look at your Titanfalls, and what many gamers see is quite simply a gamble. A roll of the dice. A $60 roll of the dice, where the enjoyment of their experience is not 100% under their control. An experience that, despite being based in solid mechanics and well-designed systems, can be ruined by servers going down, can be ruined by the assholes you play with, or can simply be ruined by having nobody to play with at all. When you think about it, it's really quite ballsy to try and release a full-priced multiplayer-only game on PC, especially when you're competing with free, very cheap, and titles which are less games now than titanic institutions. It's weird to think that Ubisoft with Rainbow Six Siege is actually the David rather than the Goliath. I can't imagine that that's really a situation that Ubisoft finds themselves in all that often. Players can be made to come around to the idea, and I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it. I don't think there is an arbitrary acceptable price point for multiplayer-only games. I don't necessarily think that multiplayer-only games should or have to be cheaper than your regular title that includes a single-player component. It is a trend that will continue, not necessarily at the expense of single-player experiences, but it is a genre and a business model that is fighting a PR war. Compared to the relative slap on the wrist that Halo Master Chief Collection had for months upon months of completely broken multiplayer, you'd read a forum and think that Ubisoft or Blizzard with Overwatch and Rainbow Six Siege had drowned thousands of puppies and laughed. Such a mortal sin it must be to release a multiplayer-only game. It's okay though, as long as you've got a single-player campaign, we're just gonna let you get away with completely broken multiplayer for months at a time. We're gonna excuse that. This is a battle for hearts and minds. If anyone has the best chance of winning gamers over in it, I think it's probably Blizzard. They have enough goodwill and fan loyalty on their side to do it, and this is in spite of the absolute nonsense that went on with the launch of Diablo 3. It often seems like you'd have to pay people to say nice things about Ubisoft, considering the laundry list of buggy releases, exploitative business practices, and PR nightmares that they've gone through and perpetrated within the last few years. It's easy to turn around and say that gamers are entitled. They think that they deserve more than their $60 actually gets them. They're unreasonable, their expectations are too damn high, they don't know enough about the industry of game development, they are wailing hyper-consumers, obtuse shit-slingers. But those are the arguments of the narrow-minded, the ignorant, the hateful. It's not the consumer's job to come around to this business model. It's the developer's job to convince us that it's worth our time and money. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. But gamers have real concerns, and they're grounded firmly in precedent. If you want this business model to work over the long term, I have very simple advice for those developers and publishers. Build a good game, manage expectations, speak to your player base, and provide the support that these games deserve. Shouting at people for spending the money that's rightfully theirs, that's not going to get you anywhere. And that applies not only to devs and publishers, but those that would defend their games of choice. You attract more flies with honey than with vinegar. Why do so many of these arguments seem to boil down to don't suck and everything will be fine? My name's been TotalBiscuit, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, by all means feel free to click the like button, and if you did not, your pleasure can be expressed with an angry click of the dislike. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.